So, Anton, you've made a career based on risk, essentially, managing risk. How would you say young people should calculate which risks to take?
Okay, well, I think with risk, what it comes down to is people tend to look at risk incorrectly. So they look at risk in the two-dimensional traditional sense, which is to look at risk where you say, okay, the more risk I take, the more potential reward or loss I can have. So that's looking at it two-dimensionally. The more risk I take, the more volatility I have, essentially. When in reality, in the real world, risk is actually subjective to your own personal situation. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's take, for example, a jobs scenario. So let's say, for example, you've got a job where you're earning $50,000 a year, and you believe that having that job is safe. There's no risk. But let's move on one step forward from that. Let's say, for example, you want to quit your job. So if you want to quit your job with no risk, you line up another job beforehand and you agree a higher salary with another employer, and you move on to that other job by quitting your current job. So you line it up before. But let's say we scrap that and just say, okay, well, what if I just quit my job? What's the likelihood of me ever earning more than $50,000 a year in the future? Well, when you look at this and you calculate downside versus upside, it's pretty obvious. I mean, let's calculate the downside first. So what can you possibly earn that's less than 50,000? Well, you can earn 40,000 a year, 30,000 a year, 20,000 a year, zero. Your downside is 50,000. But the real downside in reality is very small. It's very likely that you're going to earn somewhere around 50 or just less than that. So that's calculating the downside. But what about the upside? Well, your upside is actually all the money in the world. It's infinite. It's infinite. So even if you have a very, very small percentage chance of earning infinity or all the money in the world, you're still earning more than 50,000. So your downside is very small and your upside is huge. Now, the person who takes or has the $50,000 job to begin with tends to anchor themselves to that number. And then the next step is always to then, if you're anchoring yourself to that number, to take on liabilities that this number can pay for. And that to me is more risky. And that's why risk is subjective and not fully two-dimensional in the real world, because it's subjective to your own personal situation. So in that scenario, you feel like you're not taking risk, but you are, because you're taking on lots of liabilities, and therefore you actually can't assess risk objectively. And this is the problem with risk in the real world, is that most people can't look at it objectively. So when we looked at that jobs example, we very objectively calculated downside versus upside. But if you have all these liabilities, you can't look at it with clarity. So going back to this point that we've talked about before, with freedom, and freedom being the number one asset that you can possibly have. Freedom allows you to be objective when you're assessing risk, because you will look at everything with clarity and look at everything with very simple downside versus upside. And the ideal situation to work towards is not having personal liabilities and assessing risk in terms of business by essentially trying to work towards business risk where you've got very limited downside but huge upside, and getting yourself into that situation and repeating it an infinite amount of times so you can become wealthy. So, for young people, in terms of what risks they should be taking or looking to take, the first thing to do is step outside yourself and assess your current situation. And if you have lots of liabilities, you need to work towards freedom. And if you work towards freedom, you're working towards a situation in which you can assess risk objectively. So step outside yourself and look at yourself objectively and work towards that situation. And it's difficult to do, but it's something that just has to be done. Otherwise, you're going to always remain in a situation where you cannot assess risk objectively. So step outside yourself and get the clarity. Work towards it. And then try to position yourself in scenarios all the time where you have very limited downside and business risk, but huge upside. And for me, that's the key. So if you understand that risk is subjective, you can then take the next step to working towards being objective and then getting yourself in that scenario, calculating downside versus upside correctly, and repeating it an infinite amount of times. If you do that well, you'll become wealthy.